connection before correction, increasing engagement and motivation through conversation. That's the idea. And that's what we're going to practice today. So yeah, let's get right into it. We're going to blend restorative practices with motivational interviewing. And here's some of our objectives. We'll learn a student-centered conversational framework. It's called OARS. If anyone's familiar with motivational interviewing, I saw some of the school psychologists put in their names in the chat. This might sound familiar to you. We'll learn how to respond to challenging situations with effective communication, proactively engage with our kids at home and students from a distance, and transform restorative circles for distance learning. I don't know, that seems weird, but we'll do that too. Yeah, so I want to, these first few slides will be mostly just some background information on restorative practices and MI. The reason why I've blended these two approaches, one is because with restorative practices, I found that they don't always offer a conversational approach that helps out with the practices that you're actually utilizing in your school setting. And motivational interviewing focuses totally on language and what you say and how you generate motivation. So it offers restorative practices some tools to be more effective. I went and got my master's in restorative practices, and that's what I wrote my thesis on, how to sort of advance the practice and how to utilize conversational approaches that can help our students. So if you're looking to implement restorative practices at your school setting, some people like to use like a tier model, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 type of thing that is sort of a 2 to 3 year rollout. And that's fine because it does take about 3 years to sort of roll this out effectively and implement it across your school setting and utilize your personnel correctly. But the 3 things you're going to want to do is you're going to want to create conditions for engagement. And that happens with the way that we interact with students and families, and that also happens with the way that we're utilizing circles and various social emotional learning activities within our classroom. We want to be able to interact with our students on a level playing field and really listen and hear where they're coming from and create activities around that, some of which will be I'll be showing you today. So I hope you can leave with a few of these activities that will help you out right away. We want to respond to low-level discipline with relationship affirming approaches instead of punitive discipline. So what I mean by that is that with the statewide ban on suspensions for willful defiance-related infractions, we have to kind of figure out a different way that we're going to respond to sort of that kind of misbehavior that is typically labeled as defiant or non-compliant or whatever other words that we attach to sort of not listening or being disruptive or what have you. So we're going to practice some relationship affirming approaches today through a practice called stop, drop, and roll. And lastly, a restorative school uses RJ, restorative justice, to repair harm and reconcile tension. A lot of the times we think of restorative practices and restorative justice as the same thing. They're not. Restorative practices is the large umbrella and restorative justice falls under it. Restorative justice emerged in the criminal justice field as an alternative to conventional practices that sort of put everything in the court's hand and distanced victims and offenders from one another. It's evolved into the educational sphere as a modality to help students sort of get together and interact with each other in the midst of conflict instead of separating them, suspending them, sending them to different schools. And sort of restorative justice at a school that's being restorative should really be used maybe 10% of the time, while the other 90% is focused on the first two numbers right there. Oh, I like this. I can just click my mouse pad and it moves. All right. So why are we doing this? School discipline sits at the intersection of the most pressing social problems of the past 4 decades. We live at a time where we're really trying to understand how to become more anti-racist with our organizational layout and introduce equity into education. And sometimes we hear that a lot, but we don't really know how to do it. So we'll talk about that in a bit. But quickly, I think we know now that suspensions correlate with juvenile justice involvement, and we know that defiance and willful defiance correlate with suspensions. So we're trying to figure out different ways to interact with our students in the face of tough situations. And yeah, so I'm moving quick through these because I like to get into the stuff that's actually fun. I don't know if anyone's ever seen, and then I'll stop for questions after this slide, if there are just a couple questions before we really get into it. I don't even, if anyone's ever seen the social discipline window, that's a foundational element of restorative practices. There's 4 foundational elements. If you were to come to like a 3-day training, we would go over all 4 of those, but this is the most important one. This kind of gives us an idea and a roadmap of how we want to be when we're working with kids. The 2 up in the top left corner is when we're kind of in this punitive mode where we're using our power over someone. That's characterized by a high level of control and a low level of support. It could be punishment oriented, getting mad at students, not hearing where they're coming from. And sometimes we tend to find ourselves in this box when we're frustrated and it's 5th period and we're dealing with a bunch of 9th graders who just got in from lunch and it was 85 degrees outside. And it's like, oh my gosh, can this day please end? Or we might find ourselves in the neglectful box, which is a low level of support and a low level of expectation. Permissive tends to be a place where we might be when we first get to know our students. We want to be in a place where we're understanding and really supportive, but maybe we're not setting the bar too high. And restorative is the with box that's highlighted right there. That's when we're working with someone, honoring them as people, high level of support and high level of expectation. So there's some of the theory. Now let's get into the fun stuff. So the next part is going to be about individual interactions we can have with students to really transform our relationships and to increase motivation. Maybe we can put in the chat, well, maybe we won't. Really, like the shift to distance learning has kind of shown me a few different things. One is that our conversational skills are as important as ever. One, because it's harder to get a hold of our students and parents because we no longer have the luxury of the schoolhouse where they come and they go and we track attendance accordingly. We're trying to facilitate learning from a distance, and sometimes we might be like 1 for 4 with our phone calls. And that one time we get a hold of a family or a student, we really have to talk to them in a way that's going to create buy-in and increase their motivation. And that's not true for all students. It's certainly been true for a lot of the kids in alt ed and the teachers I'm working with. They've been asking me a lot for some help in reaching out to families and sort of helping families create the buy-in for students academically. So I've been working with teachers on how to utilize their conversational skills in a way that's going to create the buy-in without having to rely on other people. So that's been something I've noticed, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Does anybody have a question you can throw in the chat, really? Or Jeff, have you noticed anything coming up yet? Because I'm moving quick.
I'm coming off double mute, sorry. No, nothing yet. Everything's all good.
Okay, cool. So here's our conversational flow. We're going to use this when we're talking to students from a distance. We can use this all the time in the classroom. It doesn't really matter. But these are a couple skills I want you to leave with today. Open-ended questions are questions that evoke and generate conversation, and they also set up your listening. We're going to go through a bunch of different open-ended questions that can be really powerful, and that when students hear them, they want to talk to you. Not questions like, how are you doing, or how's the day going, or what's summer like, but questions that actually start a conversation that can be extremely powerful. Affirmations are simple statements that show empathy. A reflection is the most important part of our conversational flow. It's reflective listening not only affirms where the student's coming from, but it can be used to guide the conversation in a direction leading towards change. And then we want to summarize. We want to actually, when we're talking to kids, if we've had a 2-minute conversation, we want to just say, hey, let me see if I can check my listening here. Tell me what I missed. And then you want to recap what you heard from them. So we'll practice all that stuff. And you're not going to, maybe you will, I don't know. You might leave as just totally ready to rock this out, or you might need some practice, and that's all right too, because this is just an hour. So open versus close-ended questions. And after this, I'm going to ask you to do something, and then maybe we could put it in the chat and also have a little share out. But here's an example of transforming questions. And these are all questions that I've heard since distance learning started. So this is actually like stuff that's been going on recently. You can see on the left, there's the topic, attendance, behavior, and grades. And there's an example of a closed-ended question and an open-ended question. So attendance, don't you know that if you keep missing school, your family will get in trouble? Actually, I think that was a question that I heard asked before distance learning that was involved in the SARB process. So that's a rhetorical question. It's closed-ended. The student in that sense might get defensive. It might create discord, or it might lead to a response like, yeah, I already know, where there's some apathy. Instead, ask, if you started showing up some more, how would that help out your family? And all of a sudden, the student's able to really see how missing school has an impact on their family, and it's open-ended and it's not judgmental. Behavior, do you understand why your teacher sent you out of class? I mean, that's not that close-ended, but it's also not the most open-ended question. That's a common question I hear administrators ask students when they get sent to the office. And it normally, the response of the student is normally like, yeah, because or they explain everything that the teacher did wrong. And then you're in this like detective mode, and we want to avoid that. Instead, sometimes starting a conversation with what's the hardest or worst part about being in this class, or the most difficult part. Grades, are you okay with just getting D's and F's? I've heard that a couple times too. And a lot of the times the student may say, yeah, whatever, I don't care. One of the questions that's been really, really, really impactful since the shift to distance learning, and every time I ask this, it seems to get the conversation moving in a really positive direction. And when we think about equity, I tuned into Marty Krovitz's session yesterday, and he was talking about equity and providing social emotional support for families to level the playing field and really see where students are at with their learning from a distance. This question is big time. Considering all of the other things you got going on right now, where, if anywhere, do academics fit in? That allows the student and the family, I know this might be an unpopular opinion here, that allows them to say it doesn't fit in anywhere with what's going on. Right now, I'm living at home, I'm babysitting my brother, my mom's back to work, I have to work in the afternoon, I have no time to do school. And then as an educator, you're able to have an accurate picture where things are. You can affirm their position using ors and say something like, clearly there's a lot going on right now that's making this hard to do. And then the student will then maybe respond to that, and then you reflect, and then you can begin planning with them on some small little steps to start getting school going. That's a disarming way to get the conversation moving. All right, so next, that's close-ended to open-ended. We're gonna do a little activity here. I gotta figure out what time it is because I kind of lose track. 9:51. Oh, for a second, I thought we started at 8:35. All right, we're good. Okay, open it up. Yeah, this is for you, for everybody to do, I guess, if you want to. We'll take a couple minutes and do this. Take a look at these close-ended questions and turn them into open-ended ones. The speaker thing up in the corner is because this is an interactive presentation. I'll give you access to it in a Google Doc toward the end of this, and you can look at it when you leave and see if you like it. It kind of guides you through stuff. It doesn't work on Google Slides though. So take a look at these close-ended questions and turn them into open-ended ones. So yeah, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these. If you would like, let's spend 2 minutes doing this. Choose one question out of these 5, which are close-ended, and see if you can open it up more. Jeff, I'm not sure. Are you still there, Jeff?
I am here.
Awesome. Yeah, I figured you were. If you weren't there, that'd have been pretty wild, but whatever. So there's I think I sent you a Google Doc, and there's some open-ended question starters.
Okay, let me find it.
So for those in the audience, you can go ahead and choose one question and transform it into an open-ended one from a close-ended question. And when you're done, put it in the chat. And then we'll explore it together if that's possible. And then if there's a Google Doc I sent with some good open-ended question starters, if that helps you transform them. Does that make sense to everybody? If it doesn't make sense, just unmute yourself and then just blurt out that makes no sense. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so we'll take a minute or two.
Yeah, Julius, a couple questions coming into the chat. So
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for participating. Appreciate it.
Yeah, whatever. Feel free to say them out loud to me. That's fine.
Yeah, first one that came in was, how can I help you participate more in distance learning?
Okay.
Another one is, tell me about your experience with logging into distance learning. What is going well? What did you find challenging?
Nice. Good.
Yep. And then how does it, there are a bunch coming in now. Sorry guys, trying to keep up. How does it feel when your work isn't completed on time? How would it feel if your work was completed on time?
Okay. Nice.
How can I help support you and your family as you experience distance learning and the pandemic?
Okay.
What would it look like if you smoked pot a little less each day?
Oh, great. Great question.
Great question.
Great question.
How can I help your family get food or resources?
Okay.
That's a great one. What challenges is your family facing that are not school related?
Beautiful. Beautiful.
In what ways might you help keep the house organized?
Okay.
And then how would you choose to demonstrate your learning?
Okay. Cool. Some really good ones. Yeah, let me respond to a couple of those. Really, thanks everybody. That's awesome for just jumping right on that and doing that quick. One of the questions let me start with this. With teachers, I've been telling them to not talk about school with their students if their students haven't been logging into distance learning. Just talk about everything else with them, and then the academics will unravel. Sorry, my 3-year-old, she's excited. It's around that time of day where if she doesn't get outside, we get pretty fired up in here. So, yeah, so talk about everything else besides school. And then the school piece will fall in naturally once you affirm and figure out where everything else is at in the student's life. So yeah, that would be my suggestion. I love the substance use question. I think we get scared when we're talking to kids about substance use. That question about what would it look like if you smoked pot less, that's a profound question because it allows the student to explore what that might look like, and then they can maybe get interested in that change. A lot of the times with substance abuse, we fall into what's called an advice or expert trap, and we tell kids everything that's bad about it, and they already know that, and it's not conversational. So kudos to whoever asked that. That was a great question. The question I've been avoiding is how can I support you? And maybe I'm avoiding this, and this could be my own bias. It's because the response tends to be like, I don't know, whatever, nothing. That's what I've been hearing a lot. So that said, if that question works for you, and the family and the student provide you with a wealth of knowledge and answers to get the support rolling, then by all means ask it. I just be aware of it. We can ask that question differently. So great job. Thanks for doing that. So this is a fun activity. I sometimes, I'm so obsessed with it, I go home and I write down all the dumb questions I asked during the day, and then I sit when my daughter goes to sleep and try to open them up more. And that's what I do. So maybe I'm an outlier in that regard, but that's kind of what's got me to focus on this stuff. So, okay. Affirmations. We're going to move through this quick. I have one suggestion for affirming people's experience. And I'll share that with you. Affirmations are simple reflections. They show accurate empathy. They are statements that show the speaker that you are hearing what they are feeling. They're powerful. They really, if you affirm a student after they tell you something, they're going to feel something that they're not used to feeling when talking with adults. And that's someone who's truly taking the time to be with them with their experience. So saying things like, it's difficult to log into school every day, or you're in a tough spot right now, or you're feeling annoyed with that class, or nobody understands what you're going through. I really like the last one. It's extremely powerful because it allows the person to really recognize that you're willing to admit that you might not understand either. And so that can be a big time thing. What I would say with affirmations when you're affirming someone, don't say sounds like or what I hear you saying. Just go straight to the source. Sometimes we get caught up with the sounds like thing, and it can be too pathologizing. One time I went to a therapist. I was like in my mid-20s, and I was just talking about stuff that I was going through in my life. And he just kept telling me sounds like. He would be like, sounds like it's really hard for you. He just said that the whole time until the session ended. I was just like, it sounds like I might need to kind of get out of here. But yeah, I would just try to, if you just take sounds like out and just go right to the affirmation, it's going to hit harder. And same with what I hear you saying. It's less conversational to do that. And it might work for you. So if it's working for you, keep it going. These aren't like rules or guidelines or anything. They're just suggestions. Oh, my battery's running. I gotta plug this in real quick. Hold on. So that's affirmations. We use those a lot of the times after the student responds to our first question. That's open-ended. Now, do we have any comments or anything else that's going on right now that I should address before we go to reflections? Okay, I'm going to move to reflective listening here. Reflective listening is listening. I was
going to say, like you're talking about the affirmations with students. I found actually they were really effective with getting parent support, because a lot of the parents got really defensive about why their kids weren't logging in. And I thought, I did the mom to mom thing. I have 3 kids doing it. This is hard. The struggle is real. Is there anything I can do to help? Yeah. I want to make sure your kid's okay. I don't really care they didn't do their work. Okay. My kids didn't want to do the work either. I just want to make sure the reason I haven't heard from them is because they don't feel like doing my work, and not that they can't get out of bed. And I found that, just by telling them that, this is hard. None of us wanted it. I understand, because they start apologizing for, oh, well, it's like, oh, I know you have a lot on your plate. I just want to make sure, that everything's okay.
Beautiful. And I think that's powerful, because thanks for sharing out. Yeah, just saying that honors where they're coming from. And we're going to work, we want to be careful for being overly affirmational, because it can come across as permissive and it can excuse the young people for not participating. And that's where we're going to get to in a few minutes here. But providing an affirmation at first is great, because it gets us out of the informational trap. It's called the informational dump. Sometimes as educators, we're so used to providing information to students and families. Hey, this is your attendance. This is your grades. This is what you did this week. This is what you not this is what you didn't do this week, because that's your job. You have to do that, but that's not conversational, and distance learning requires a conversational approach more than anything. So that's why those affirmations at first, they allow us to just start somewhere. So reflective listening is basically to the speaker what they said in a different way that's more profound. So it guides the conversation in a direction, it's non-judgmental, and it recognizes the emotional experience of the speaker. It shows them that you're listening and understanding them. Here's a bunch of reflections. I don't expect you to memorize them. We're only going to go over a couple of them today. But yeah, this is like, if you look at this presentation, which I think is kind of fun, but I'm biased because I made it. Afterwards, there's a Google Doc with a link at the bottom that will share out to you, and you can kind of just click on one of the ovals, and that reflection will take you to an example of how it's used, when it can be used in context with the kid you're working with. So this is called the reflection zone. These are all the different reflections in motivational interviewing. And I just want to remind people that motivational interviewing also is a restorative practice. It's the conversational trajectory we want when we're working with students on an individual level. And then we'll get into groups in a little bit. So here's agreement with the twist. This is a conversation I was privy to, and I had to document it because it was pretty cool. A reflection that affirms what the speaker is saying, but also offers a new meaning or direction. This reflection helps move the conversation away from the status quo. Here's the conversation flow. Student or child, it was just way easier to do my work at school. Now it's too easy to get distracted. This is where, if we were in a large group and we weren't on Zoom, I would ask how many people have heard some iteration of that since distance learning has started. Maybe in the chat, you could just put a thumbs up or a yes or something if you've heard a statement like this. It was easier to do my work at school. Now it's too easy to get distracted. What the parent or the teacher can say when they hear this is, these new changes get in the way for sure. I think, Eden, were you the one who, I think you were the one who was just speaking. These new changes get in the way for sure. You said something of that nature. So that's the agreement. That's the affirmation. Yeah, they get in the way. This is tough. And yet you felt better about yourself when you got your work done. So that affirms, but it also brings in the element of self-esteem. So it correlates getting schoolwork done to how someone feels about themselves, which is powerful. And then the student might say something like, yeah, it made me feel like I earned it, I felt better about myself. So all of a sudden, now you have a place where you can plan about how to do schoolwork, now that you know that schoolwork actually helps the kid out. So here's a double-sided reflection. Double-sided, a reflection that reflects both sides of a person's ambivalence. We're not going to get into ambivalence today. I'd love to talk about it with you all at some other point. Adolescents are constantly ambivalent. Adults constantly want them to not be ambivalent. Even though we might understand the adolescent experience, we also have this wealth of knowledge about what's right for adolescents, and sometimes we like to impose that. It's kind of like this natural tendency to do so. But a double-sided reflection allows us to not be the expert. Here's an example. Student or child, I want to stop. Oh, yeah. If you have a thumbs up here, that'd be cool too. If you've heard something involving video games for kids being at home, this might be relevant. Like, I want to stop playing so much so I can get my work done, but I have so much time to get better so I can beat my friends online. Video games, that's like the new thing. I used to like going home and playing NBA Live and Madden, but it's really taken off these days. So, yeah. Parent or teacher could say, here's the double-sided. On one hand, you care about school, and on the other hand, you're competing against your friends, which is fun. That's essentially just reflecting where they're coming from, instead of telling them, yeah, but video games are bad, let's get offline, you got to do your schoolwork, Then the student or child will say, exactly, like, hey, you're listening to me. The teacher can say, tell me, and then tell me more is a great question starter. So when you're talking with students and families, tell me more is really powerful, because it's disarming, and it shows them that you're interested and curious. You're not just asking questions to get somewhere, you're asking it to learn. Tell me more about wanting to get more schoolwork done. What are some reasons for wanting that? So that takes the one side of the ambivalence, which is like, I want to stop playing so much, and ask, what are some reasons for wanting that? So when you ask open-end questions, that's a really good one. What are some reasons for wanting to make a change in this part of your life? What are some reasons why schoolwork would help out your family more? Well, the teacher would stop bothering my mom. Well, right? So that's a good question starter. Gosh, I got to check the time because we got stuff we got to do. Okay, we got some time. Communication traps. We're not going to spend a ton of time with the communication traps. But if you look at the presentation, these are some traps we fall into. And then in 2 minutes, we'll open it up for a little conversation before we get to the group stuff. Yeah, so we tend to do all these things all the time, including myself, who likes to think that I'm somewhat decent at communication. I fall into a lot of these traps all the time. So in the doc, there's a bunch of examples of these traps, and on this presentation with the link, you can explore all of them. Here's an example of what giving advice sounds like in the context of a conversation about academics and distance learning. You know, you really should listen to your teachers when they tell you you have to start doing some of your work. This would be a parent talking to a student or a child. Yeah, I know, I just don't feel like it. It's hard when you aren't there, you know. Like, hey, it's hard when I'm not at school. School is what helps me do my work. It's social. I get to see my friends. I like my teacher. So all of that stuff's taken away. It's hard. I know, but you have all this time. Why don't you set up a schedule for yourself for the week? So now the parent's trying to give them advice on what might help, but that misses the mark because they missed the affirmation. I've tried that before. That doesn't work for me. Well, if that doesn't work, you're going to have to find something that does, because I know it seems like, oh, I didn't finish that part. But anyways, you kind of get the idea there. That's what kind of giving advice might sound like. Oh yeah, this is one of these things. I get to keep clicking. This would be to climb out of this trap. This is what the conversation flow would look like, I think, using either agreement with a twist or the double-sided reflection. Yeah, I know, I just don't feel like it. It's hard when you aren't there, you know. So here's the double-sided reflection instead of the giving advice trap. Parent would say, it's not easy at home, and yet you still know it's important to do your best. So that's a lot less threatening. There's no top to bottom, parent to child stuff going on. The student would say, I guess I just need to give myself some time to start. All of a sudden, the student's voicing reasons for making a change. When the student can hear their own voice for wanting to do something, all of the evidence suggests that they will be much more motivated to do it. A classic example is my mom was 100% right all the time with everything, all of the advice she ever gave me about school and life when I was 16 years old. But the fact that it didn't come out of my mouth made me not want to do it. So when we're working with adolescents, that might be the case for some of them as well. Student voices change and increased motivation. Boom. So we're going to go past this one because we're kind of moving quick. Stop, drop, and roll. This is really important. This allows us to respond to defiance or discord or resistance in a way that's non-threatening and disarming. We pause before we pounce. We drop our automatic response and we roll with the resistance. I'm just going to go quickly over the example. It's too bad that we're not in person because this tends to be the most fun activity of the training, where you get to work in groups and come up and shout out your real life conversational examples, and we get to role play them. Maybe we'll do that at the end. So let's move through this. Okay. So restorative circles. Some of you may be using these in your school right now. Obviously, when we're learning from a distance and incorporating a hybrid model of education into our school system, we have to figure out how to still utilize the circle process without actually having a talking piece, being able to pass it around, and having a centerpiece and sitting in a circle. So a couple differences. In person, we get to use that talking piece. Circles can be sequential or non-sequential, or even what's called a fishbowl circle. So sequential is passing the talking piece around in one direction. Non-sequential might be tossing the talking piece, moving into different directions, giving it to people who are ready to respond, and so on and so on. From a distance, our circles are more activity driven. They're more SEL oriented. They can still involve an item with their sharing. So if you're still utilizing restorative circles with your students, so say you have a class of 10 kids and you're on Zoom and you're doing the thing and you want to start off with a restorative circle, one of the really powerful experience is having the student share an item that means something to them. When we're in person, we have them bring that to class and they put it in the center and do that sharing. And that item, if they give consent, can be a talking piece for the circle. While you can't use it as a talking piece, you can still have them share it. They show it on Zoom and they tell a story of why that item means something. And you can utilize breakout groups with your restorative circles. You can put your students into dyads, shares, that kind of stuff. Let's pause for questions right now because I have a couple fun exercises I want you to take with you that have been generating some laughter and some critical thinking and talk. So let's pause for questions, and I also want to hear from anybody who has some real life examples of maybe a conversation that's worked for them or a situation that you're currently struggling with, maybe with a student or a family that maybe we can role play or model. So yeah, feel free right now to unmute yourself and kind of speak up if you want, or I'll answer questions in the chat too.